This is part 2 of Whole Hope from Reconstructing A's A, starting with Section 6. Section 6. Humans have ways by which they preserve their whole hopes, their vicarious lives, and can exercise these methods without even realizing it. If everyone thinks we are math geniuses, we may avoid public displays of math in order to avoid putting at risk their image of us. If we know people who once used to think we were beautiful, we may avoid them, wanting them to remember us as we were, not as we are. And we may do this so that they can continue to remember us fondly and hope in us, aware, at least unconsciously, of the emotional happiness of whole hope. As we have ways to keep away people to whom we are a source of whole hope ourselves, we have ways to keep a distance from that which we want to continue providing us with whole hope. We can all want to be wholes, either to provide hope or simply to avoid misunderstanding, which entails within a hope for understanding. For someone who is not easily understood, such as an artist, keeping a distance might be a way to avoid facing people's concerns about his or her future, and by being a whole to them, the artist can arrange it so that others can imagine the artist as not a daydreamer, making empathetic understanding easier to achieve. Furthermore, an artist can even hide his or her art from others so that they can imagine the artist not as an artist, hence freeing the artist from the negativity others can hurl upon those they don't understand. On the flip side, people may criticize artists more who are wholes, not experiencing the reality of their lives those artists live. Sadly, artists who fail to employ wholes to their advantage may seek absolute isolation, which comes with its own problems. In different ways, we are all like the artist, often hiding our true selves so people can imagine us differently. Naturally, as if rehearsed 100 times, a couple that has just been arguing can put on a sweet face and act polite around neighbors who suddenly appear at the door. And in so doing, the couple functions as an ideal others can hope to be like, a couple who others can think their relationship is perfect when meeting them. And in this way, others can put their hope in the couple by believing perfect love is possible, for example. Just knowing that a couple is out there who is happy lets us believe happiness is possible in this world, even if we never achieve it, and so give us reason to live. Like the couple, regardless how depressed a girl may have felt an hour ago, upon going out in public, the girl can come off as the happiest person who ever lived, inspiring others to be happy themselves. This isn't inherently bad, but it can be. When the reality of the happy girl starts to show, when her depression emerges, she may suddenly cease functioning as a whole hope for others, which may result in her feeling guilty for failing in this way, result in others treating her in such a way that makes her act the way she should again, or result in others thinking there is something wrong with her, when in fact she is simply being realistic. But realism isn't typically what any of us want on the onset, though it is arguably what we all need, and what we need to do everything in our power to never experience, what we seem to do everything in our power to never experience. Many of us can want to be wholes, even those who achieve and accomplish truly great things. Those who win the Super Bowl know that their achievement doesn't make life as wonderful as one might think, though this isn't to say winning the Super Bowl isn't wonderful. But, not wanting to infringe upon the dreams of children, the athlete may keep this truth to his self and continue to be a symbol, a whole of what children dream to achieve. In this way, the football player creates a distance between the person he presents to people and the person he is to himself. And thanks to this distance, the athlete can function as a whole. A source of hope can make life easier for others to strive and work through. Likewise, and for similar reasons, parents can hide their true selves from their children while simultaneously making their children wholes and sources of hope to them, which the parents may become wholes themselves in order to preserve. As children can hide their true selves from their parents, all while thinking they are the only people in the world who do this sort of thing. The examples abound. Wholes are everywhere. Section 7. Whole hopes can create hard-to-escape cycles that are hidden from us by veils of newness. Before we are married, for example, marriage is a whole to us that we can fill with our imagination. But once we are married, singleness becomes a whole again. Faced with the realities of singleness, we want marriage, but once faced with the realities of relationship, we can want singleness. In idolizing singleness, we may choose to get a divorce, and upon being single again, we may soon find ourselves idolizing marriage again with someone better. And so we may again get married, only to find the reality of it disappointing, especially when comparing it with the idolized whole of singleness. And so we get divorced again, caught in a cycle. Once we are hired for a job, all other jobs become wholes relative to us. Miserable where we work, able to imagine that the jobs of others are better, we may quit and try something else, setting ourselves up for an endless movement between imagined jobs and real jobs, a cycle in which our imagined job Wholes always fail to be as good as the reality of any actual job. Likewise, once we decide to live somewhere, all other places become wholes, tempting us to instigate a life of perpetually migrating between realities and idolized wholes. Once we decide a hobby, all other hobbies become wholes. Once we choose a spouse, all other spouses become wholes, and so on. Temptations to endless cycles of idolization, cycles of temporary happiness that slide back into disillusionment are everywhere. If we don't learn to be happy with the life we are currently experiencing and to ground our hopes in reality rather than idolization, we can easily get swept up in one of these cycles. Perhaps one of the main reasons people end up in such situations is a failure to identify the cause of their unhappiness. Some think they are unhappy in the marriage because their husband isn't the right person, when really they are unhappy with having to live in a reality that is a mixture of the good and the bad versus a reality that is only good. This isn't to say that it is never the case that a husband is a source of unhappiness, only that one must be sure it isn't the nature of reality itself that is upsetting to them, rather than a thing in reality. When a person fails to do this, when a person fails to realize that the cause of their unhappiness is the way the world is and all its tragedy, trade-offs, incompleteness, and so on, versus a thing in the world, the person could easily keep falling into whole hope cycles, thinking the cause of their pain is a thing, when really it is a pain that emerges whenever an idolizing person encounters the real. Along with this confusion, another reason people end up in whole hope cycles is because they fail to realize that newness hides us from the fact we idolize whole hopes. It can keep us unaware that we are even idolizing and make us think we are only viewing the truth. There is a sense in which it is the newness itself which makes a person happy more so than any new objects. Encountering the new, we forget about ourselves and are swept up in it, forgetting that the emotions we feel come with our subjectivity, not what we encounter. Encountering a beach we've never been to, we can be swept up in our imagination and thoughts about how beautiful it is, how much fun we'll have there, how it's different from all the other beaches, and so on. Encountering the new, our subjectivity can seem to strike us as objective. We can feel as if what we are saying is absolutely true. A reason for this is because we have not encountered the reality of the beach to know better. Hence, our subjectivity has never been wrong about the beach, to recognize itself as subjective. Where there is a lack of reality, and so a lack of encountering that which unveils the subjective as subjective, like a river hitting a rock, the subjective feels objective. And it is this feeling which can contribute to us getting swept away in a whole hope without us realizing we are being so swept. Rather, we can think we are just experiencing the truth, lacking experiences of reality to know better. Holes, newly covered traps, are everywhere. Section 8. What we experience will often be handicapped against what we do not experience. What we do not experience will have the advantage of our idolization and imagination against what we do actually fill with reality. The government bill we are thinking about passing will have an advantage over the bills we have already passed, as with the job we aren't doing, the person we aren't married to, and so on. This isn't to say we will give in to these temptations, but simply to suggest that if we aren't aware of how whole hopes may appear idolized to us, our discernment will suffer. Consequently, we may give up the life we live for a figment of our imagination that, upon realizing and reaching, would turn out to be a reality that was a worse mixture of the good and the bad than the reality we surrendered for it. Though this paper has focused primarily on how wholes are idolized, there is another dimension of wholes that should also be addressed. As we can idolize what a whole is to us, we can also be overly critical of it, suggesting another reason why we need to avoid having holes in our lives as much as possible. If we hated college, once we've left it behind, we can think of only the bad things and none of the good. As we can idolize only the good into a whole, we can also project only the bad, avoiding tension either way, which is still to engage with the world unrealistically, for reality is composed of a tense mixture of the good and the bad, not just one or the other. To think of college, marriage, and so forth as entirely bad is to think of it as unrealistically as does one who thinks of it as entirely good. Please note that none of us probably think we do this, and yet practically do. Yet even when overly critical of wholes, there is still a sort of hope embedded in the act, for to think college as entirely bad is to indirectly think it shouldn't have been this way, which can imply there exists the possibility of a college experience that isn't entirely bad, and so something in which to hope. To be overly critical can imply the existence of something better to hope in. When we are overly critical of wholes, rather than idolize good into them, what we don't experience is handicapped against what we do experience. This is a different treatment of wholes than what most of the paper has focused on. But as with the idolization of wholes, being overly critical also skews discernment. We can all too easily criticize the government bill we haven't passed, the jobs we don't have, the countries in which we don't live, the people we don't know, and so on. Yet even in this act, we are giving ourselves hope, for we are hoping that the life we live now is better than the lives we could live. For example, in this act, rather than unrealistically devaluing our reality by comparing it with idolizations, we try unrealistically to raise our reality up by bringing other possible realities down. Both acts are unrealistic and so wholish, not only because the acts consist of considering reality in terms of good alone or bad alone versus a mixture, but also because they are acts of imagination rather than acts in and of the real world. In this overly critical act, rather than making others our source of hope, we make ourselves our source of hope. We imply, for example, that the choices we made are good ones, and by extension that we are capable of good, perfect choices. We can also imply that we are wiser than others, more discerning, and so on. We make ourselves worthy of putting hope in by others and ourselves. This is perhaps less abstracting than idolizing hopes and has a more concrete grounding in the self, but it is still certainly not as beneficial as whole hope with the W, as will be explained, for it too is rooted in unreality, a whole. It is an unreal whole, not grounded in reality, but in an imagined view of what our lives are like. We don't actually know if the lives others live, the jobs others work, and so on are better or worse than our own, and so to value our life by comparing it with other lives which are all wholes relative to us, is to ground ourselves in ignorance, in a hole hidden by newness. And in order to maintain this value, we must keep ourselves as wholes, for to experience the reality would now be a threat, and we all seem to have methods to keep others as wholes. Being overly critical of wholes is another kind of whole hope, where we idolize our own life by devaluing the lives of others. As with idolizing wholes, this act doesn't actually improve the quality of life, but only creates an illusion of improvement. As even the kid who runs slowly can feel like he runs fast when racing against kids slower than him, so the person living a mediocre life can feel he lives a good life if he imagines everyone else as more miserable than himself, and this imagining may result in the person not changing when he or she may be capable of such. Such critical imagining of wholes doesn't raise a person up to a higher level, but drags others down in his or her mind, either to the same level or below the imaginer, making the imaginer feel either equal or superior without any actual improvement. Only illusions are entertained, illusions that provide whole hope for the imaginer. It should be noted here that those who critically imagine wholes can also do so in order to distract themselves from the bad of the reality they live, hence making the reality seem good alone versus a mixture of the good and the bad. In this way, the critical imaginer is identical to the idolizer of wholes. Both avoid reality, create and preserve wholes, hope, and struggle to discern. When we make choices in life, we must always choose between wholes and our reality. In life, wholes are unavoidable, as choice is unavoidable. But if we are aware of how whole hopes can appear to us better than reality or overly criticized, we will know we must try our best to picture what those wholes will actually be like in reality if filled with experience per se, rather than let ourselves be swept up in our imagination and idolization. This will help us be more discerning and more grounded in reality, and if we learn to have whole hope instead of whole hopes with the H, our discernment will remain grounded. But what is WHOLE, hope, whole hope? It certainly sounds like whole hope, at least. Section 9. Either through imagined idolization or criticism, we constantly use one another in anything that is a whole in reality relative to us to give ourselves hope to live against reality itself. When we get into the habit of whole hoping, it becomes increasingly difficult to live realistically. As the longer a drug is used, the harder it is to quit, and so it becomes increasingly difficult for us to switch to WHOLE, hope, whole hope, regardless how much from it we would benefit. Whole hope isn't grounded in the idolization or criticism of wholes. To be in finitude and time is to be amongst wholes, but we can choose how we interact with those wholes. Do we envision them realistically to the best of our abilities, or do we let our imaginations dominate? Yes, imagination to some degree is unavoidable, for to pick between options, wholes, for example, requires some degree of imagination, which isn't always bad, and bound imagination is important and valuable. But we can and must choose to check and balance our imagining with realism, with a view of the world that isn't either good or bad alone, but a mixture of the good and the bad. We can work and choose to catch ourselves when we begin idolizing or over-criticizing, helping us be realistically discerning and so make more real our choices. On this line of thought, a prime concern of this work has been to make the reader aware of the phenomenon of whole hope, so that readers can be more discerning about which wholes to realize and fill with reality. However, though real discernment and realistic imagining will help us from falling into whole hope, discernment alone cannot provide us with hope, which all of us need to be motivated to live. We need something else, some grounding, some experience. Whole hope, which I will call in this reading holistic hope, is grounded primarily in experience versus imagination. It is based on what I've perceived versus thought, a distinction expanded on in the book, Reconstructing A as A, the reality I've undergone versus envisioned. Yes, wherever there is hope, there must be some imagination involved, but imagination based on what I've experienced is radically distinct from imagination, which is unbound by reality. Whole hope resulting from unbound thinking, while holistic hope is made whole precisely in being is made holistic, precisely being bound and anchored to real experience. It is made holistic by those experiences, while whole hope is missing an essential dimension it needs to be useful and complete, perception and experience, thus leaving it a whole. Whereas whole hope is missing reality in favor of imagination and thought, holistic hope works hard not to leave reality behind. In this way, holistic hope is filled with the world. Now, my experience of the world can never be identical with the world unless I'm God, and so my experience and perceptions are always limited, simply because I cannot experience everything. Considering this, there is always something missing from even holistic hope, but at least when I'm aware of the pitfalls of whole hope, I can make myself toward experience, perception, and wholeness. To orient myself toward experience is an important step in the right direction. For that means I'm habituating myself to deconstructing and questioning my ideas about how life should be, how people should live, and what's best. Critically, since experience and perception must ultimately be limited, this means my deferring to them is to accept a degree of limitation and level of incompleteness in my life, which ideas don't necessarily have to accept, able to exist on an idealistic plane. I find wholeness precisely in the act of deconstructing all temptations and dreams of completeness. As will be expanded on throughout Reconstructing A as A, I find wholeness in accepting that I must be lacking, homo iago, as will be described later in the book. The person trying to live according to holistic hope is neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but a realist. Since hope ultimately has to do with motivation, the person who ascribes to holistic hope attempts to find motivation to live in real and everyday life, while the whole hoper mainly searches for motivation in dreams and ideas and even denial. Not to say all dreams are bad, it depends. Since reality is difficult, consists of trade-offs, and often fails us, the whole hoper finds motivation while looking down at the imperfection and still finding reason to cherish it, while the whole hoper looks away from the world and up at the clouds, searching for shapes and specters. The holistic hoper is motivated by the world to walk through the world, while the whole hoper is motivated by the sky to wait for ascension. When we are whole hopers, we are motivated more extrinsically than intrinsically. But to be motivated intrinsically requires facing the lack which dwells within us all, the limitations of being. If we are to be motivated by what's in us versus an idea of what's inside of us, we must accept reality, which also means accepting our own imperfections and shortcomings. This is hard, but a life of intrinsic motivation is critical for avoiding a life motivated by extrinsic wholes. We decide on the shape of our lives when we decide on the nature of our motivations. Our motivations determine what we are toward, and so what structures and identifies us through time. We are generally a collection of memories, choices, desires, and so on. And the kinds of memories we possess, the kinds of choices we make, and so on, will be relative to the hope we make all our choices and experiences in and toward. Divine-like motivation, originating out of being, transcends the time which a being cannot transcend to guide the being through temporality so that the being may be structured as the being so wills. If we want to be a great soccer player, we will probably desire to buy a soccer ball, experience playing and garnering memories of soccer games, meet other people who play soccer, and so on. What motivates us will shape us, for our motivation determines how our being moves through time and toward death. To be motivated is to have purpose, and purpose entails hope. A hopeless purpose is a contradiction. Intrinsic motivation is holistic, while wholes are extrinsic motivators. This isn't to say all extrinsic motivators are necessarily bad, but it is to say that it's ultimately better to rely on intrinsic motivation. Motivation is how we drive through the changes of life. thoughts of others, and uncertainty which surrounds us. But if we are motivated by holes, we'll probably end up in ditches. Whole hope is a non-contingent hope. Reality is here, after all. While external holes can only provide hope as long as they remain holes. Once they are filled with reality, the hope is gone, suggesting why we develop methods to preserve and create holes. Unfortunately, in society, there seems to be much more whole hope than holistic hope, perhaps because determining an intrinsic motivation and so purpose is very difficult, and even painful, requiring introspection. Hence, it is likely easier and more natural to whole hope, and this ease and lack of pain can trick us every time to keep whole hoping, a mistake that's especially easy to make because it can be so difficult to tell whole hope and holistic hope apart in experience, as alluded to by the terms being homophonous for both feeling hopeful. We are either predominantly an image and likeness of extrinsic motivations or an image and likeness of intrinsic motivations. Arguably, life isn't even possible without motivation, let alone a life with a meaningful shape. Our motivations are indivisible from our hopes, and since our motivations shape our lives, taking the time to inspect and own the nature of our hopes will directly impact the kinds of people we manifest. Though it's difficult to face and perceive lack, limitation, and imperfection, there's no other way for us to manifest holisticness, and we must not look away from the lack once we glimpse it, which will not be easy, for it will be tempting to quickly look to others and believe that they are not essentially lacking, but rather just holes that can be filled, that they are different from us. We will want to believe the imperfection is concentrated in us, and make others a possible source of a relief from ourselves. But everyone is ultimately lacking. No one is a fillable hole, only a hole into which we can shovel that which never hits bottom, despite how much we may treat them as otherwise. That, or when we glimpse our essential lack, we will be tempted to deny it and believe we are fillable, which ironically is the very act which makes us unable to be holistic. Paradoxically, in denying essential lack, whole hope is ontologically negative, while holistic hope is ontologically positive. When holes are our hope, we ourselves become empty and unreal holes instead of holistic, while if we accept our essential incompleteness, we can find wholeness in that lack. When we are externally motivated by the holes of others, we become those holes, for we make ourselves into the image and likeness of our motivations. But when we are intrinsically motivated by the lack of ourself, we can become holistic. Becoming holistic requires living by and accepting experience and perception, which is to accept limitation, imperfection, trade-off, tragedy, and the like. We then give up the possibility of filling holes, for we stop believing in holes at all, a self-forgetfulness which paradoxically is a kind of way to fill holes by making them disappear, per se. This is because holes are spaces that can be filled, and the holistic person accepts that life entails incompleteness that cannot be filled or effaced. As negative space is necessary in art for images to be possible, an image without space between subjects would be a messy blob, so our lives cannot erase spaces without being messed up. We become holistic when we cease trying to fill holes and instead accept our own lives on their own terms. Holistic, we seek to make our world better by walking in and through it instead of rising above it. Section 10. Whole hope is a rainbow that appears with a blue sky, while whole hope, holistic hope, is a rainbow that appears with a rainstorm. Whole hope is based on an absence of reality and imagines unrealistically, putting the imagined and real at odds, while holistic hope strives to be grounded in reality and imagined realistically, blending the imagined and real together, however imperfectly. Whole hope can emerge from a refusal to accept the world as it is, while holistic hope tries to create motivation rooted in experience and perception. Whole hope is threatened by sudden realizations of reality, while holistic hope grounds itself in and readies itself for experiencing reality, a mixture of the good and the bad. Action committed out of whole hope is typically done to preserve hopes, the ground of their possibility, while action committed out of holistic hope is done to help us live in the real world. But holistic hope is hard to maintain, and even if we stop living according to holes today, we can slip into the temptation tomorrow. The effort to fight holes must be daily. It is doubtful that any of us avoid whole hope entirely, though hopefully with time we can improve. It sometimes even seems that our brains are wired to be everything but realistic, and yet we associate our brains with thinking, which is supposedly in the business of knowing the real, and believing this, we don't check and balance our thoughts as we should. Naturally and unconsciously, we surround ourselves with holes. We must fight our brains to free our minds. The brain doesn't seem to naturally think in terms of trade-offs or mixtures. Instead, it seems to approach the world in terms of all good or all bad, perhaps due to survival mechanisms of some kind. We seem wired to idolize and project, and the nature of reality presents us with countless opportunities to fall into the temptation to vicariously live and fall into a hole. But knowing better, we can work to change and even do our best to stop functioning as holes for others. Each one of us will always be a hole to some degree. We alone can inhabit our minds, after all. But we can avoid feeding whole hope by avoiding static anxiety, by telling the truth, by not contributing to existential escapism, and more. None of us can live perfect lives, but not all failures are equal. Anyone at any moment can choose to cease living according to holes and strive to be holistic, as anyone can cease living according to vulgar time in favor of ecstatic time, as Heidegger discusses and Johannes teaches on brilliantly. We simply must make a choice and stick with it. A decision can transform all time. If we choose to become a pilot, suddenly, as if reaching back in time, all the moments before that choice can suddenly turn into moments leading up to it. As discussed throughout O.G. Rose, the choice is a flip moment, a moment that redefines the nature of all moments. If a person spends years working on a book, the second the book is accepted for publication, suddenly that second transforms all those previous moments into good uses of time, even though up to the moment everything possibly felt like a waste. Rarely are there no opportunities for flip moments, meaning there is always a chance to transform bad choices into good ones, redeeming the past as if it was never in need of redemption at all. Our life can always be redefined. There is always hope. The question is only, what hope will we have? This has been Whole Hope by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.